After the Sunday service, she slapped me on the church steps, the air thick with candle wax and the fading echo of the bells. My father just watched, his lips a thin line. "We'll talk Monday," he said. He forgot what I do for a living. I am the head of controls and ethics at Lanford Systems, where all my talks come with minutes and evidence. That Monday, I walked into the 37th floor glass conference room with a file box, a USB drive, and a clause they'd never read to the end. My name is Harper Quinn. I am 32 years old, and on a brittle, sun-bleached Sunday in late autumn, my world was cleaved in two on the steps of a church. The place was St. Wren's in Alderford, a postcard town of old money and even older secrets. Sunlight, thin and pale as aged parchment, spilled over the granite steps, catching in the rust-colored oak leaves that had gathered in the corners, clinging stubbornly to the soles of our shoes. The final hymn had faded, the last blessing had been given, and the congregation was spilling out into the crisp air, their polite murmurs a soft counterpoint to the distant chime of the bell tower. The air itself smelled of America in October, a mix of decaying leaves, wood smoke from a distant chimney, and the lingering, sacred scent of burnt-out prayer candles that clung to the wool of our coats. I clutched my mother's old King James Bible to my chest, its leather cover worn smooth and soft as a river stone. It felt less like an object of faith and more like a shield, thin and inadequate, against the storm I knew was gathering. She moved with the frictionless grace of a predator. Vivian, my stepmother, all sharp angles and Chanel No. 5, a scent so cloying it felt like an occupation. She didn't raise her voice. She never did in public. Instead, she closed the small gap between us, her manicured fingers wrapping around my wrist with a surprising, wiry strength. The pressure was a prelude, a quiet tightening of the leash. Her face, a carefully maintained mask of pious concern just moments before, was now pinched and venomous. "You ungrateful thing," she hissed, the words barely a whisper, meant only for me. They were small, sharp stones thrown in the placid water of the post-sermon calm. Then her hand came up. It was a fluid, practiced motion, a gesture of absolute authority. The slap wasn't loud, but it was brutally distinct. It was a dry, sharp crack that seemed to silence everything else. The wind rustling the skeletal branches of the maples, the distant traffic, the low hum of conversation. It was a sound that belonged in a back alley, not on the hallowed steps of St. Wren's. For a split second, the world compressed into the blooming, fiery sting on my left cheek. It was a heat that spread with astonishing speed, a brand of pure, distilled humiliation. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw two parishioners, a husband and wife from the Historical Society, falter in their descent, their heads turned, their eyes wide with a flash of raw, unvarnished curiosity. Then, as if controlled by a single string, they both swiveled their heads away, their gazes locking onto the meticulously pruned rose bushes bordering the walkway. They became intensely interested in the thorny, barren canes, their bodies radiating a desperate pretense of not having seen, not having heard. Their complicity, their silent agreement to erase the moment, was a second, colder slap. I looked for my father, Daniel. He stood a few feet away, a statue in a bespoke tweed jacket. He hadn't moved to intervene. He hadn't flinched. His hands remained in his pockets, and his gaze met mine for only a moment before sliding away to some neutral point in the middle distance. There was no anger, no concern, not even surprise. There was only a weary, impenetrable blankness. He pursed his lips, the gesture of a man closing a ledger. "We'll talk Monday," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a promise of resolution. It was a sentence. It was the sound of a heavy door swinging shut and a deadbolt sliding home, locking me on the outside. In that moment, he was not my father. He was a corporate executive managing a messy personnel issue, deferring it to business hours. I didn't react. I stood perfectly still on that top step, the cold of the granite seeping through the thin leather of my shoes. My cheek throbbed with a furious, pulsing heat, but beneath the pain, a different part of my mind was already working, cataloging, processing. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I isolated the scents in the air, the waxy, honeyed smell of the church, the sharp, floral assault of Vivian's perfume, the damp, loamy scent of the earth, olfactory evidence. I lifted my eyes, not to my family, but to the small, discreet dome of the church's doorbell camera, mounted on the stone archway to the left of the main doors. I registered its position, its likely field of view, a perfect, unobstructed angle of the top step, of the three of us, of the slap. My fingers, still clutching my mother's Bible, were steady. My purse hung from my shoulder, and inside, my wallet felt heavy, dense with meaning. Tucked into a sleeve behind my driver's license was a single, crisply folded sheet of paper. It wasn't scripture. It was an authorization, signed by the CEO of Lanford Systems the previous week. It granted me, as head of controls and ethics, the power to initiate an emergency internal audit of any vendor, department, or executive, bypassing all standard channels. A document born of whispers and inconsistencies I'd been tracking for months. A key to every locked door Daniel thought he controlled. Tears burned at the back of my eyes. A hot, useless pressure. I refused to let them fall. Crying was a concession, an admission of pain, and I would not give Vivian that satisfaction. Instead, I focused on the frantic, panicked drumming in my chest. I started counting the heartbeats. 1, 2. The fire on my cheek was a wildfire of shame. 3, 4, 5. I forced my breathing to deepen, to slow. 10, 11. I felt the heat begin to recede, not vanishing, but changing. 12, 13. The flames of humiliation were being systematically quenched. The emotional energy transformed, forged under the immense pressure of my will into something else entirely. 30, 31, 32. By the time my heart rate settled into a slow, cold, and steady rhythm, the fire was gone. In its place was ice, a hard, clear, surgical certainty. Vivian was smiling now, a small, tight, victorious smile. She adjusted the silk scarf at her throat, confident in her domain. To her, this was home turf, the church, the community, the web of social alliances. This was where she held power, where an emotional outburst could be framed as a mother's justified discipline of a difficult daughter. She believed she had won the day on her chosen battlefield. She was wrong. She just didn't realize that I had no intention of fighting her here. My home turf wasn't a place of faith and feeling. It was a place of facts and figures, of bylaws and regulations. My battlefield was the 37th floor. With a composure that felt alien and yet utterly natural, I reached into my coat pocket and slid out my phone. My thumb moved over the cool glass screen. My movements economical and precise. I opened a secure messaging app and composed a new message to the 3-person legal team that reported directly to me. The message was short, stripped of all emotion, a pure directive. Flag for Monday AM review. Event, Sunday, 12:15 p.m. Location, St. Ren's, front exterior. Tag, Quinn, D. Quinn, V. Initiate evidence preservation protocol. I hit send. The small confirmation buzz against my palm was the only sound that mattered. It was the quiet click of a timer being set. Daniel had said we would talk on Monday. He had no idea how right he was. The conversation had already begun, and I would be the one setting the agenda. The drive home from St. Ren's was a masterclass in silence. It was a dense, suffocating quiet that filled the opulent interior of my father's Mercedes. A silence more damning than any shouting match. The scent of supple Napa leather and Vivian's expensive, funereal perfume mingled in the climate-controlled air. It smelled like a gilded cage. I sat in the back, a passenger in my own life, watching the manicured lawns of Alderford slide past the tinted window. My cheek was a dull, persistent throb, a physical reminder of the morning's transaction. Up front, my father, Daniel, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale mountains on a brown leather range. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his corporate face firmly in place. Vivian sat beside him, serene, occasionally checking her reflection in the vanity mirror, patting a single strand of blonde hair into submission. They were a perfect portrait of upper-middle-class composure, a living, breathing mirror, but I had spent years studying the hairline fractures just beneath the polished surface. Daniel had remarried 2 years after my mother's death, a period of mourning he seemed to treat like a fiscal quarter, to be endured and then closed out. Vivian wasn't a stranger. She was an import from his professional life. She had been a culture consultant for Lanford Systems, a title as nebulous and unquantifiable as smoke. Her job had been to walk the halls and talk to people, producing reports filled with corporate jargon like synergizing strategic actualization and fostering a paradigm of proactive engagement. She was an expert in saying nothing with a great deal of confidence. Overnight, she transitioned from consulting on the company's culture to curating our families, her Pinterest-worthy aphorisms, once deployed in boardrooms, now echoed through our home. "A family is a circle of strength," she'd say at dinner, while subtly criticizing the way I held my fork. At company galas, draped in silk, she would tell industry reporters, "At Lanford, we're not just a team, we're a family," a statement that, in retrospect, was far more of a threat than a promise. I had joined Lanford a year before she and my father married. I came from the unforgiving world of Big Four accounting, a place where numbers were the only truth and sentiment was a liability. I was a forensic auditor by training and by nature. I didn't just balance the books. I hunted through them, looking for the ghosts, the anomalies, the stories that people tried to bury in the footnotes. Daniel had been the one to bring me in. "It's time you came home, Harper," he'd said, framing it as a paternal gesture. "Find a stable position here. Sit still for a while." But I understood the subtext. He didn't want his brilliant daughter. He wanted his daughter under his roof, under his control. He thought he could domesticate me by giving me a corner office, that I would be content to sit still and draw a handsome salary. He, like Vivian, fundamentally misunderstood my profession and my constitution. I wasn't built to sit still. I was built to dig. My refusal to be decorative became a problem for Vivian's carefully curated family image. My questions in quarterly review meetings, my tendency to demand data to back up broad, sweeping statements, were seen not as due diligence, but as insubordination. So, Vivian made a project of me. With the subtle influence she wielded over my father, she had human resources enroll me in a series of communication recovery courses. They were pitched as leadership training. But I knew what they were. I called them my silencing sessions. I'd sit in beige, windowless rooms with other mid-level managers, being lectured by a facilitator with terrifyingly white teeth about active listening and non-confrontational dialogue. We were taught to rephrase direct questions as gentle inquiries, to validate feelings before presenting facts. It was a corporate brainwashing designed to sand down any sharp edges, to turn watchdogs into lapdogs. Vivian's fingerprints were all over it. She was trying to professionally neutralize the only person in her orbit who viewed trust not as a feeling, but as a verifiable state. Her influence didn't stop with me. She saw the company as an extension of her personal empire, a place to install her own loyalists. My half-sister, Sloane, was the primary beneficiary. Sloane was 24, armed with a liberal arts degree and a masterful command of Instagram filters. Vivian manufactured a position for her, Director of Brand Experience. Sloane's job, as far as I could tell, involved approving color palettes for marketing materials and taking tastefully overexposed photos at sponsored charity luncheons. She was perfectly pleasant and utterly vapid, a smiling, compliant cog in Vivian's machine, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the mechanics that had placed her there. The first real crack in the mirror appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. 6 months ago. It wasn't a dramatic shattering, but a small, almost imperceptible flaw. A new batch of vendor contracts crossed my desk for ethical review. Part of a new PR push spearheaded by Sloan's department. 3 new agencies: Haven Ridge Media, Lattice Events, and Bluefinch Creative. They were all boutique firms, specializing in the kind of experiential marketing that cost a fortune and produced no measurable results. On paper, they were separate entities, but as I read through the invoices, my auditor's brain began to itch. The inconsistencies were subtle, but they were there. All 3 invoices used the same slightly non-standard font, a sans serif that was just a little too rounded, a minor detail, but odd. Then, a recurring typo. Across documents from 3 supposedly distinct companies, the word "its" was consistently misused as "its" in the boilerplate legal disclaimers. It was a grammatical fingerprint. The final damning piece of evidence was the payment information. The corporate addresses were different, 1 in Delaware, 2 in Wyoming, all leading back to registered agent services, a classic shell game tactic. The company names were different, but the bank routing number and the final account number for wire transfers were identical for all 3. It was a rookie mistake, a shortcut born of arrogance. They had built 3 elaborate false fronts, but had directed all the money to flow through the same single, hidden door. I took my findings to Daniel. I chose a moment when he was in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his power: the mahogany desk, the skyline view, the photos of his perfect new family. I laid out the invoices, pointing to the identical account numbers. I was calm, factual. I presented it as a security concern, a potential flaw in our procurement process. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at me. His expression a mixture of disappointment and irritation. He sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "Harper," he began, using the patient tone one might use with a difficult child. "Vivian and Sloan are working hard to build a new kind of culture here. Sometimes that means moving quickly, working with agile new partners. These partners are all the same entity. Dad, this isn't agile. It's deceptive. It violates 6 internal control policies." That's when he delivered the line that drew the battle lines between us forever. He steepled his fingers, looking at me over the top of them. "In our family, we operate on a foundation of trust." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. He wasn't the CEO of a public company talking to his head of ethics. He was a patriarch demanding fealty. "This isn't our family," I replied, my voice as quiet and steady as I could make it. "This is a publicly traded company, and in this company, we operate on a foundation of verification." His eyes hardened. The meeting was over. From that day on, I began to build my case in secret. I created a new, encrypted folder on my personal drive. I named it simply Monday. Into this folder, I began to collect the shards of our family's shattered mirror. Every invoice from the 3 shell companies, every email I was accidentally copied on, with Vivian giving Sloan oddly specific instructions about payment schedules. I set up alerts for Sloan's social media. Her Instagram became a treasure trove of evidence, a post of her drinking cocktails at a lavish resort in Arizona, hashtagged brand retreat, geotagged and time-stamped, perfectly matched the invoice from Lattice Events for a mandatory employee wellness seminar that no employee, outside of Sloan herself, seemed to have attended. Each piece of data, each digital breadcrumb, was another file saved, another exhibit prepared. As the Mercedes finally pulled into the long, curving driveway of my father's house, the engine humming into silence, the spell was broken. Vivian was already turning to me, her face reforming into a mask of concerned matriarch. "Harper, dear, I do hope you'll reflect on your behavior this morning." I didn't answer. I simply met her gaze, holding it for a beat longer than was comfortable. The throb in my cheek had subsided, replaced by the cold, steady pulse of purpose. She could have her Sunday. She could have her performance of piety and her public displays of power. I had Monday. Monday began in the dark. I was in my office on the 37th floor before the sun had even begun to dilute the deep indigo of the sky over Alderford. The city below was a sleeping beast, its arteries of light still pulsing with the rhythm of the night. My office, unlike my father's mahogany-lined den of influence, was a space of clean lines and stark functionality. A glass desk, a black chair, a single, healthy orchid. It was a room designed for clarity, and I needed absolute clarity for what I was about to do. The faint, humming residue of Sunday's fury had been transmuted overnight into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Emotion was a liability. Today was about process. At 6:05 a.m., I logged into the Lanford Systems governance portal. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. I navigated to the Office of Controls and Ethics internal dashboard, selected Protocols, and from a drop-down menu, I initiated the one tool they never imagined I would use against my own family. I formally activated a vendor integrity sweep. It was a right granted to my position under the company's internal Sarbanes-Oxley compliance charter. A powerful piece of corporate law designed to prevent the kind of fraud that could crater a company's stock price overnight. It was a kill switch. The digital form I submitted was sterile and impersonal. It listed the vendors: Haven Ridge Media, Lattice Events, Bluefinch Creative, and cited bylaw 11.3b. Suspicion of related party transactions and improper financial disclosure. Submitting the form was like pulling a pin on a grenade. It sent automated, non-revocable work orders to 3 separate departments, and the clock was now officially ticking. The first order went to IT Forensics. My request, automatically generated by the system, was for a full metadata and content extraction from the email account of Vivian Quinn, VP of Corporate Culture. For the preceding 24 months, a legal hold was immediately placed on her account, preventing the deletion of any data. I made a critical choice. I did not request direct access to the emails myself. To do so would have opened me to accusations of a personal witch hunt. Instead, I had the system grant access to our e-discovery software. I spent the next hour building a search query for the platform's AI. I fed it keywords and conceptual links, the vendor names, invoice numbers, the IBAN account number, and on a separate targeted search, terms like St. Ren's, donation, Gabriel, and pledge. The system would do the reading for me, cross-referencing the terms and generating a report that would highlight only the most relevant communications, stripped of context and emotion, presented as pure, actionable data. The machine would be the witness. By 8:30 a.m., the first results of the sweep began to trickle into my inbox. The procurement department was first. Their email contained a single, damning attachment, an IBAN and Swift code reconciliation report. It confirmed what I already knew, but this time it was on official letterhead, an undeniable artifact in the corporate record. 3 vendors, 3 different names and addresses, 1 single destination for Lanford Systems money, a ghost account that was about to give up its dead. 10 minutes later, a report from accounting landed. It was a spreadsheet detailing expense classifications. A junior accountant, simply following the automated instructions from my sweep, had flagged an anomaly. He noted a series of payments to Lattice Events for internal morale and training retreats that had been coded under the general and administrative budget. But one payment stood out. A wire transfer for $50,000, sent 2 weeks prior, had been categorized as a community outreach sponsorship. The memo line, entered by Vivian's own executive assistant, read, St. Ren's New Pew Initiative. It was the smoking gun, a charitable donation, likely to curry favor and maintain her pious public image, had been laundered through a shell company and disguised as a legitimate corporate expense. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. I took the printouts and walked to a small, unused conference room at the end of the hall. This became my war room. For the next hour, I worked at the large whiteboard, the squeak of the dry erase marker the only sound. I drew boxes for Lanford Systems, for the 3 shell vendors, and for the single bank account. I drew arrows, mapping the flow of the $2.7 million I had so far been able to trace. From the data in the accounting report, I found the name of the receiving account. The Alderford Family Trust. It was my family's private trust, established by my grandfather. I uncapped a red marker and drew a thick, bloody line from the shared vendor account to the trust. Then I drew smaller lines branching off, labeling them with Vivian's name and Sloane's. The diagram on the wall wasn't a family tree. It was a conspiracy flowchart. My next call was to an external number. Mark Ellison was a partner at a litigation firm we kept on retainer for sensitive internal matters. "Mark," I said, my voice even. "I'm calling in that third-party advisory chit. I have a meeting at 2 p.m. I need you present as an independent observer for the audit committee. I'm sending the preliminary file now. You have 90 minutes. There was no surprise in his voice. Men like Mark were emotional firewalls, paid to be unflappable. "I'll be there. Harper." Having him in the room would be my shield. Transforming my actions from a daughter's revenge into a director's fiduciary duty. Then came the binders. I spent 2 hours at the high-volume printer, compiling the evidence into 12 identical dossiers. Each was a self-contained story of the fraud, told through contracts, invoices, bank statements, and email metadata. I tabbed each section meticulously. I used blue tabs for the binders going to the board of directors, gold for the audit committee members, and stark black for the one reserved for our general counsel. Each binder was an anchor, heavy with facts, designed to drown them in irrefutable proof. Into a separate, smaller envelope, I placed a single, sterile USB drive. On it was one file, Trends Ext Cam 1. Sunday, MP4. It was the video from the church's doorbell camera, which I had procured that morning with a polite, formal request from my office to the church's security provider, citing a potential corporate asset integrity issue on their premises. I had watched it once. The video was clear. The audio crystalline. The sharp crack of the slap. Vivian's venomous whisper. And my father's voice, devoid of care, sealing his fate with 2 words. Talk Monday. This USB drive wasn't for the financial audit. It was for the moral one. It was the answer to the inevitable question. Why couldn't you handle this privately? At 1:15 p.m., I sent the meeting invitation. The attendee list was precise. My father, Vivian, the general counsel, the 3 independent members of the audit committee, and my external lawyer, Mark. The subject line was a carefully chosen piece of bait. I didn't call it an investigation or a disciplinary hearing. I titled it, Urgent Review, Corporate Culture and Vendor Alignment. It was irresistible. Vivian would see the word culture and assume it was a meeting to celebrate her initiatives. She would walk in expecting a coronation. My father would see vendor alignment and think it was a routine operational review. They would both walk into the glass-walled conference room on the 37th floor willingly, with no idea it was an ambush. My final preparation was my own. I stood before the mirror in my private washroom and looked at my reflection. I was wearing a simple, brutally white silk blouse, buttoned to the collar. It was armor. The cuffs were crisp and long, completely covering the faint, fading bruise on my wrist where Vivian had grabbed me. No part of the victim would be on display. I was not there to elicit sympathy. I was there to execute a procedure. As I packed my briefcase, placing the binders and the USB drive inside, my hand brushed against my mother's Bible. I paused, then picked it up and placed it on top of the files. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was a weight, a testament to the legacy they had corrupted. It was my standing, my claim to the soul of the company my mother had helped build. I was ready. The talking was about to begin. The conference room on the 37th floor was a terrarium of silent, simmering tension. The air was cool and sterile, recycled and scentless. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But it offered no warmth. My father and Vivian sat on the opposite side of the vast, polished obsidian table, their initial confidence already beginning to curdle into wary confusion. The 3 members of the audit committee, grim-faced and impartial, sat between us, forming a human buffer zone. Mark Ellison, my external counsel, sat slightly behind me, a silent, observant presence. The 12 black binders I had distributed sat closed before each person, like unread indictments. I stood at the head of the table, a remote in my hand. I clicked it once. The screen behind me, previously a placid blue, blinked to life. This was the part of my job I excelled at, taking a complex web of lies and illuminating it with the cold, unforgiving light of data. This was the hidden ledger, the second set of books they never thought anyone would find. This was an accounting of where the money went when the lights were off. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice calm and measured, echoing slightly in the tense silence. "We're here to discuss a significant variance in our G&A spending, specifically related to our new corporate culture initiatives." The first slide appeared. It was a simple bar chart, stark and brutal in its clarity. As you can see from the Q3 financials, our budget for employee engagement and experiential marketing has increased by 38% over the previous quarter. That represents an unplanned, unbudgeted spend of over $2.7 million. I paused, letting the number hang in the air. Normally, an increase of this magnitude would be accompanied by a detailed report on key performance indicators, KPIs, increased employee retention, brand sentiment scores, media impressions. However, for this entire expenditure, there are no KPIs on record. None. The money was simply spent, with no measurable return to the company or its shareholders. It vanished into a black hole of good intentions. Vivian shifted in her seat, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Culture isn't about numbers, Harper. It's about feeling. It's about creating a holistic, supportive environment." "I agree," I said, clicking to the next slide. "So let's examine one of those holistic environments." An invoice appeared on the screen, a clean, professional PDF from a company called Lattice Events. It was for a spiritual care and leadership retreat in Scottsdale, Arizona. The cost was $150,000. This invoice is for a senior leadership retreat that, according to procurement records, no senior leader other than the director of brand experience actually attended. I clicked again. A second image appeared next to the invoice. It was a brightly colored, sun-drenched photo from Sloane's public Instagram feed. In it, she was holding a champagne flute, surrounded by a dozen smiling friends in bridesmaid dresses. The caption read, "The most beautiful wedding for the most beautiful bride. Love you. Chloe, maid of honor duties." The geotag was Scottsdale, Arizona. The date stamp was the exact Saturday of the supposed spiritual care retreat. "As you can see," I continued, my voice a monotone, "the retreat coincided perfectly with a personal wedding celebration for a friend of Sloane's. We paid for a party, not a paradigm shift." I didn't wait for a response. I clicked again. Another vendor. Bluefinch Creative. Standard company policy, as everyone in this room knows, dictates that all non-payroll wire transfers must be submitted for processing no later than 4:00 p.m. on a weekday for next-day settlement. It's a basic internal control to prevent rushed, unscrutinized payments. A new document filled the screen. It was a wire transfer confirmation from our corporate bank. This payment to Bluefinch, for $90,000, was initiated via a priority transfer at 10:47 p.m. on a Friday night. It required a special override code, an override that can only be authorized by a C-suite executive. I let my gaze drift to my father for a fraction of a second. It's the financial equivalent of sneaking out of the house in the middle of the night. It's a payment designed not to be seen until it's too late. Click, the third vendor, Haven Ridge Media. A series of invoices appeared, all for vague services like community media placement and synergistic brand outreach. I highlighted one line item in particular, a $50,000 charge, described as St. Ren's Parochial Media Buy. Next to it, a small note from Vivian's own office. Per VQ's instruction, expedite, gratitude to Freya Gabriel. "Here," I said, "we have company funds being used for a direct cash donation to a church, disguised as a media purchase, a clear violation of our policies on charitable giving, and more importantly, a textbook case of misrepresentation of funds." I took a breath and moved to the centerpiece of my presentation. I clicked the remote, and the screen now showed the flowchart I had drawn on the whiteboard in my war room. The clean corporate logos of our company sat at the top, with lines flowing down to the 3 vendor boxes, and then converging into a single box at the bottom. Haven Ridge, Lattice, and Blue Finch are not 3 separate boutique agencies, I stated. They are a fiction. They are 3 letterheads registered to P&O boxes in Wyoming. They have no employees, no offices, and no other clients. They are shell companies, and all 3 of them, as our own procurement department has now verified, are funneling money into a single, consolidated bank account. I clicked one last time on the diagram. A red arrow appeared, pointing from the single bank account to the name of the trust at the bottom of the screen. The Alderford Family Trust. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was the sound of reality crashing down. I advanced the slide. A new image appeared. It was a candid shot, taken by a society photographer at a recent museum gala. It showed Vivian in profile, laughing at something just out of frame. She was wearing a diamond necklace, a delicate, custom piece I had never seen before. I zoomed in on the central pendant. It was 2 initials, intertwined in elegant, cursive gold. H&R. H&R, I said softly, as in Haven Ridge. It was vanity, the fatal flaw of every criminal, the need to leave their mark, to admire their own handiwork. I followed this with the next exhibit, a screenshot of an email. This was sent from Vivian's executive assistant to an internal scheduling coordinator, but was accidentally copied to a general accounting listserv, an unforced error. The email was short, a photo of a page from a moleskin notebook. The assistant's looping script read, "Follow up. Meet wa Father G. New pews. V says to expense against PR discretionary fund. Check Haven Ridge balance." Vivian's face was a mask of chalky white. She looked at my father, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the screen, at the next slide I had just brought up. It was a screenshot of his own digital approval dashboard. It showed a $1 million capital allocation to a new discretionary culture fund, and there, next to the allocation, was his digital signature, a timestamp, and the final, irrefutable link in the chain. My red arrow from the diagram was back, leading directly from his signature to the name of their private trust. "Every transaction," I said, my voice resonating with a finality that felt like a gavel strike. "Every transfer, every lie, is documented in the binders in front of you. You will find the incorporation papers for the shell companies, registered to Vivian's own mother in Cheyenne. You will find the bank statements from the trust account, showing deposits from our vendors and withdrawals for jewelry, for vacations, for car payments. You will find the metadata from the emails and the digital footprints of the approvals. This is not a story. This is not a family disagreement. It is a meticulously documented, multi-million-dollar fraud perpetrated against this company and its shareholders." I clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black. The sudden absence of light was a shock, forcing everyone's eyes to readjust. I placed the remote control gently on the polished table. "The numbers have told their story," I said, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of each committee member, before letting my gaze finally settle on my father and his wife. "The rest is about the people." The black screen was a void, pulling all the sound and energy from the room into it. For a full 10 seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint, whisper-quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. The members of the audit committee sat like stone effigies, their faces impassive, but their eyes sharp, moving from me to my father, to Vivian, and back again. The weight of the 12 black binders on the table seemed to have increased tenfold. It was my father who finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat, a small, rasping sound of a man trying to regain control of a room that was rapidly spinning away from him. He chose to ignore the data, the charts, the arrows. He chose to retreat to the only ground where he still believed he held the advantage, the personal. "We are a family. Harper," he began, his voice low and laced with a counterfeit sorrow. He folded his hands on the table, a parody of a concerned patriarch. What happens within our family should stay within our family. You took a private matter and you brought it into this boardroom. You deliberately and publicly embarrassed your stepmother on the steps of a church. He was attempting to reframe the narrative, to cast me as the unstable, vindictive daughter and them as the long-suffering parents. It was a well-rehearsed strategy, one he had used to manage corporate crises for decades. Ignore the facts, attack the messenger. Vivian, seizing the opening he had created, chimed in. She placed a delicate hand on his arm, her expression a perfect oil painting of wounded grace. "It's more than that. Daniel," she said, her voice soft and tremulous. She looked not at me, but at the other men in the room, appealing to their sense of chivalry. "Harper needs to learn how to respect other women. We should be lifting each other up. Instead, she chose to attack me, to tear me down, out of some misplaced jealousy." The air thickened with their accusations. They were building a cage of familial obligation and feigned victimhood around me, hoping to trap me in a performance of apology and remorse. They expected me to break, to cry, to make this about feelings. They were waiting for the daughter. Instead, they got the auditor. I moved from the head of the table to my own seat. I did not sit. I placed my mother's old, worn Bible on the polished obsidian surface. The soft thud of the leather was unexpectedly loud in the quiet room. It was a physical anchor to a different kind of morality. Then, from my briefcase, I withdrew the small, silver USB drive. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, a tiny sliver of metal that contained a truth more potent than all their performances. "The first form of respect," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the glass walls surrounding us, "is to not steal from the shareholders who have placed their trust in this company's leadership." I leaned forward and inserted the USB drive into the port on the table's central console. I pressed a single key on the touchpad. The large screen behind me flickered back to life, not with a chart or a spreadsheet, but with a live video feed. The scene was instantly recognizable. The sun-drenched granite steps of St. Rennes. The initial few seconds were filled with the ambient sounds of a Sunday morning. The rustle of wind in the dry leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of the departing congregation. Then, the three of us walked into the frame. The camera's high-definition microphone picked up everything. Vivian's hissed, venomous words, "You ungrateful thing." The sharp, ugly crack of the slap echoed in the silent, acoustically perfect conference room. The sound was obscene in this sterile environment. The video showed my head snapping back. The brief, shocked stillness. It showed the two parishioners turning away, their complicity laid bare, and then it captured my father's face, his eyes flat and empty, as he delivered his line, his voice a chilling monotone of dismissal. "We'll talk Monday." I let the video play out for another 10 seconds, showing me standing alone on the steps, before I pressed the key again, and the screen went black. There was nowhere to hide. The video had stripped away all ambiguity, all room for interpretation or denial. It was not a story, it was a recording. The general counsel, a man named Arthur Vance, who had been with the company for 30 years, coughed lightly into his fist. It was a small sound, but it was the crack of a glacier. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the binder in front of him as if it were a legal text. "Well," he said, his voice dry as dust, "it appears a personnel issue has now firmly become a legal one." Vivian's face was a blotchy, furious red. The mask of serene victimhood had shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. "It was a moment of family frustration," she snapped, her voice high and brittle. "It was a family clash. That's all. It has nothing to do with any of this." She gestured vaguely at the binders, at the screen, at the entire proceeding that was destroying her. My finger found the touchpad again. Click, the screen lit up one last time. It showed a single, stark white number against a black background. 2,715, 422. "That," I said quietly, is a $2.7 million clash. The number hung in the air, an irrefutable, 8-digit rebuttal to her emotional plea. All the air went out of my father. He seemed to shrink in his chair, the expensive tailoring of his suit suddenly looking a size too large. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by the hollow, hunted look of a man who has run out of road. He finally looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time, I think he saw the woman I had become, not the daughter he had failed. "What do you want, Harper?" he asked. His voice was a hoarse whisper. It was the question of a man who knew he had no right options left. It was the question of a man who was no longer negotiating, but begging to know the terms of his surrender. I met his gaze. There was no triumph in me, only a vast, emptiness. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his apology. I didn't want his company. I wanted the one thing he and Vivian had spent years subverting, the one thing they believed they were above. "Process," I replied. The word, quiet and absolute, landed in the center of the table and detonated. It was not a request. It was a verdict. It meant the bylaws, the committees, the regulations, the entire impartial machinery of corporate governance that they had so arrogantly bypassed. It meant their fate was no longer in my hands, or even his. It was in the hands of the system. James Cutler, the chairman of the audit committee, a retired federal judge with eyes that had seen everything, gave a single, decisive nod. He looked at Arthur Vance. "Arthur," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that had been absent from my father's for the last hour. "Convene an emergency session of the full board of directors. Right now, inform them that the CEO and the VP of Culture are the subjects of an active internal investigation for gross financial misconduct and ethical violations." It was happening. The chain of command was reasserting itself. The system was waking up. Vivian let out a small, strangled gasp in a last, futile act of defiance. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched, reaching for the control panel on the table to turn off the projector, to stop the flow of information, to plunge the room back into the darkness where she operated best. But she never made it. At that exact moment, the heavy glass door to the conference room swung silently open. 2 members of our corporate security team, large men in discreet but perfectly tailored suits, stepped just inside the doorway. They stood at ease, their hands clasped in front of them, their faces impassive. Their presence was a quiet, unassailable statement. The room was now a secured environment. The conversation was over. The process had begun. The arrival of the security team had a profound and immediate effect on the room's atmosphere. Their quiet, professional presence was a physical manifestation of the boundary that had just been crossed. This was no longer a boardroom meeting. It was a secured proceeding. Vivian's outstretched hand froze midair, then retreated, as if she had touched an electric fence. My father sank deeper into his chair, a man utterly hollowed out. James Cutler, the audit chairman, didn't miss a beat. He looked at the guards, gave a curt nod of understanding, and then turned his attention to the other committee members, who were already opening their laptops. "The emergency session is being convened," he announced, his voice a low rumble of command. "Board members are joining a secure virtual link as we speak." He then fixed his gaze on me. It was not a warm look, but it was one of grudging respect. "Ms. Quinn," he said, the formal title a deliberate distancing from the family drama. "While we await the full board, is there anything else this committee needs to be made aware of? Any further context for the irregularities you have presented?" "As a matter of fact, yes," I said. The $2.7 million fraud was the primary breach, but the methodology behind it is just as revealing. It speaks to intent. I reached into my briefcase again and produced a thin, transparent document sleeve. Inside was a stack of receipts, the flimsy, heat-sensitive paper already starting to curl at the edges. I slid them out and placed them in the center of the table. "For the past 6 months," I explained, "Vivian has championed a new mandatory program for all department heads, the Executive Ethics Luncheon Series. The stated purpose was to foster a culture of fiscal responsibility and moral clarity in a casual, off-site setting. I fanned out the receipts. These are the 12 expense reports filed for those luncheons. As you can see, they are all from the same restaurant, Finch and Ivy, one of the most expensive establishments in Alderford. They are all for the same table, number 14, a secluded booth in the back, and they were all signed by the same person. My father squinted at one of the receipts. Vivian's name was listed as the host, but the signature at the bottom was a confident, familiar scrawl. D. Quinn. "This is an operational matter. Harper," my father mumbled, a pathetic attempt to reassert his authority. "I sign dozens of expense reports." "You do," I agreed, "but you don't sign them like this." I isolated 3 of the receipts, laying them side by side. These 3 lunches, on 3 separate dates in April, May, and July, were all expensed with receipts that show a signature time, captured by the restaurant's digital payment system, of 2:17 p.m., not approximately 2:17, exactly 2:17 and 0 seconds, a physical impossibility. I paused, then delivered the second, more subtle blow. Furthermore, they are all signed with a blue fountain pen. It's a well-known fact within this company, and certainly within our family, that you have a particular aversion to them. You sign every document, without fail, in black rollerball ink. It was a detail so specific, so personal, that it carried an undeniable sting of truth. It was the kind of detail only a daughter would know. Before he could respond, I brought up a new file on the main screen. It was a report from our IT forensics team, generated by my sweep that morning. "The reason for the impossible timestamps and the wrong ink," I continued, "is that my father never signed these. The signature is a digital forgery. Forensics confirms it was applied using a pre-saved signature template, an image file, on an iPad registered to the company." I let the report's conclusion fill the screen in large, bold letters. "Device user, Vivian M. Quinn." Vivian made a choking sound, a mix of a gasp and a sob. I helped him with his paperwork sometimes. He authorized it." "Did he authorize this?" I asked, and the screen changed again. It was Sloane's Instagram, a close-up shot of a perfectly chilled martini, an olive suspended in the clear liquid, a sliver of lemon peel resting on the rim. In the background, blurred but distinct, was the signature neon script of the Finch and Ivy logo, glowing like a confession. The caption was simple: "Best way to survive a boring Tuesday." The timestamp was 2:18 p.m., the same Tuesday as one of the ethics luncheons. While the company was paying for a $400 lunch to supposedly discuss corporate ethics, I said, Sloane was enjoying cocktails at the same restaurant, at the same time. This wasn't a class. It was an alibi. To extinguish any final doubt, I displayed a screenshot of the corporate meeting room calendar for the dates and times of all 12 luncheons. And here's the booking system for Conference Room 4B, the room designated in Vivian's official program proposal. As you can see, for every single one of the 12 scheduled luncheons, the room was officially listed as available, empty. The classes never took place because they were never even booked. The final piece of evidence was the kill shot, an email. It appeared on the screen, its text stark and damning. It was from Vivian to Sloane, sent from her phone just a few weeks prior. The subject line was, "Quick note." The body of the message was only one line. "Don't post any pics from lunch today. Already used the class code for this month's expense report." It was a confession in 9 words. It proved not just the act, but the intent, the conspiracy, the mens rea. Arthur Vance, the general counsel, who had been silently reading through his black-tabbed binder, finally spoke. He took off his glasses and looked at Vivian, not with anger, but with the weary disappointment of a man who had seen too much corporate malfeasance in his career. "Vivian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of the law. "This is no longer a matter of bad optics or poor judgment. This is a documented pattern of behavior constituting misappropriation of corporate assets and a conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of an executive's signature, falsifying expense reports, and creating a fraudulent program for the express purpose of personal enrichment. This isn't a PR problem anymore. It's a criminal one. The word criminal hung in the room, sucking all the remaining oxygen out of the air. This was the precipice. I let the word settle, then reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single, sealed manila envelope and placed it on the table in front of Arthur. "What's that?" he asked. "That," I replied, "is a formal data preservation notice, which I am serving to you now in my capacity as head of controls and ethics. It legally obligates the company to secure and prevent the deletion or alteration of all electronic and physical records related to this matter. All emails, server logs, keycard access logs, and financial records for all parties involved, for a period of no less than 90 days, pending further investigation. I filed a copy with Mark's firm an hour ago." It was the final turn of the key in the lock. There would be no deleting of emails, no shredding of documents, no covering of tracks. I had not only exposed the crime, I had shrink-wrapped the crime scene. Vivian finally broke. The carefully constructed facade of the cultured, wronged woman dissolved into pure, unfiltered rage. Her eyes, wild and venomous, fixed on me. She laughed. A sharp, ugly, humorless sound. "Is this what you wanted?" she spat, her voice dripping with scorn. "Look at you, with your files and your little notices. Are you happy now? You want to destroy this family?" I met her gaze without flinching. The last vestiges of the sting from Sunday's slap had long since faded, replaced by a profound, glacial calm. I thought of my mother, of the company she helped build, of the quiet integrity she had embodied. I thought of the employees whose pensions and futures depended on the financial health of the company they were looting for martini lunches and custom jewelry. "You have it wrong, Vivian," I said, my voice steady and clear, a single note of truth in a symphony of lies. "I'm not trying to destroy my family." I looked from her to my father, a broken man staring at the ruins of his own making. "I'm trying to save my company." The transition was seamless and chillingly efficient. The physical conference room, with its shell-shocked occupants, became the nucleus of a much larger, more powerful entity. On the large screen at the end of the table, a grid of faces appeared, one by one, blinking into existence from their home offices and airport lounges across the country. The independent directors of the Lanford Systems Board. Their expressions were uniformly grave, their backgrounds professionally blurred. The emergency session was now formally in order. The chairman of the board, a formidable former CEO named Alistair Finch, his face a roadmap of boardroom battles won and lost, appeared in the center square, his voice, clear and amplified by the room's speakers, cut through the residual tension. There were no pleasantries. "This emergency session of the board is now called to order," he stated, his eyes scanning the virtual grid before settling on the physical occupants of the room. "The Audit Committee has presented a preliminary summary of a significant financial and ethical crisis, Mr. Vance," he said, addressing our general counsel. "Please enter into the minutes that Mr. Quinn and Ms. Quinn are present. Ms. Harper Quinn is also present, in her capacity as head of controls and ethics." He then looked directly at the camera, but his gaze felt as if it were boring straight through me. "Ms. Quinn," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "The committee's brief refers to an inciting event which occurred yesterday, a Sunday incident. Please provide this board with a concise report." This was the moment. It was no longer a personal accusation. It was testimony. I stood, my posture erect, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. "Mr. Chairman, members of the board," I began, my voice steady. "On Sunday, October 12th, at approximately 12:15 p.m., on the front steps of the St. Ren's Community Church, I was physically and verbally assaulted by the Vice President of Corporate Culture. Vivian Quinn, the CEO, Daniel Quinn, was present and chose not to intervene. The event was recorded." I paused, letting the words land. This incident served as the catalyst for the activation of a vendor integrity sweep. the full results of which are in the dossiers before you. I gestured to the black binders. That report details a systemic, multi-year fraud amounting to over $2.7 million, funneled from this company into the personal trust of the CEO and the VP of Culture through a network of shell companies established and controlled by Ms. Quinn. The report includes a complete timeline, a cash flow analysis, the vendor incorporation documents, and a detailed summary of the conflicts of interest and breaches of fiduciary duty. I sat down. The presentation was complete. It was no longer my story. It was the company's evidence. Alistair Finch's gaze shifted to my father. "Daniel," he said, his voice dropping an octave, a clear sign of his immense displeasure. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" My father, who had been staring at his folded hands on the table, looked up. The fight was gone. He looked old, defeated. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice raspy, "given the circumstances, I believe it is appropriate that I formally recuse myself from any discussion or vote pertaining to this matter." His eyes, for the first time since this ordeal began, fell to the polished surface of the table and stayed there. It was a complete and total abdication. Vivian, however, was not finished fighting. She saw a vacuum of power and tried to fill it with her signature brand of corporate rhetoric. "Alistair," she began, her voice straining for a tone of reasonable collaboration, "there have been missteps, a lack of oversight, perhaps, in my passion to radically improve our corporate culture. Some lines may have become blurred, but this was never about personal enrichment. It was about making Lanford a better, more vibrant place to work. I believe what is needed here is not a punitive action, but a corridor for correction, a chance to rectify these procedural errors and move forward, stronger than before." Her plea, a desperate jumble of buzzwords and evasions, hung in the sterile air. It was met with a profound, icy silence from the screen of faces. They were not jurors in a court of public opinion. They were fiduciaries, and she had just admitted to blurring the lines with their money. Before the chairman could respond, I spoke again, my voice cutting and precise. I opened my own binder to the final, black-tabbed section. "Mr. Chairman," I said, "I would like to direct the board's attention to the Lanford Systems Corporate Governance Bylaws, specifically Clause 14.6, subsection B." I did not need to read from the page. I had committed it to memory weeks ago. It states, "Any officer of this corporation found to have engaged in acts of moral turpitude, including but not limited to fraud, embezzlement, or deliberate misrepresentation of company assets, shall be subject to immediate suspension of all duties and responsibilities. Furthermore, any compensation, including bonuses and stock options, determined to be linked to the period of said misconduct, is subject to a mandatory clawback provision, to be executed by the office of the CFO." I closed the binder. The finality of the words, "moral turpitude," sucked the remaining hope from Vivian's face. That was not a term from a human resources manual. It was a legal branding iron. Alistair Finch nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Quinn. The chair recognizes the applicability of Clause 14.6. He looked back at the grid of faces. "We will now proceed to a vote. All in favor of the immediate and indefinite suspension of Vivian Quinn as Vice President of Corporate Culture, pending the outcome of a full, independent investigation." One by one, hands were raised on the screen. The vote was unanimous. All in favor of the immediate and indefinite suspension of Sloane Quinn as Director of Brand Experience. The vote was again unanimous. "And finally," the chairman said, his voice grim, "all in favor of the formation of a special committee of the board to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the conduct and oversight of the CEO, Daniel Quinn, during which time his executive authority will be subject to the committee's review." Another swift, unanimous vote. In less than 5 minutes, the power structure of the company and of my family had been dismantled. The chairman then laid out the immediate consequences. his words like a volley of precise, non-negotiable orders. An internal 8K will be drafted immediately to inform senior management of a leadership change. Effective immediately, our external PR firm, Hillcrest and Associates, will be engaged to handle all public-facing communications. Our primary external auditors will be brought in to conduct a full, independent forensic audit of the past 3 fiscal years. The FBI will not be contacted at this time, pending the results of that audit. He paused. The word yet is implicit in that statement. He looked at me one last time. To ensure the integrity of the ongoing internal review, the board is appointing Harper Quinn as Acting Director of Independent Ethics and Compliance, reporting directly to this special committee. Effective immediately, you will have the full authority of this board to secure all necessary records and ensure cooperation from all employees. It was done. The process I had demanded was now a reality, a powerful, unstoppable machine. Just as the chairman was about to adjourn, a soft, digital chime sounded from my laptop, a calendar notification. I glanced at the screen. It read, 3:17 p.m. Execute final protocol. I looked up at the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I said, my voice cutting through the procedural wrap-up. There is one final matter. I reached into my briefcase, past the empty document sleeves and the now obsolete USB drive. My fingers found what they were looking for. A thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy with age, sealed not with glue, but with the faded, cracking wax of a signet ring. It was the last piece, the one they never knew existed. The board chairman, Alistair Finch, was about to move toward adjournment when I raised my hand slightly. Mr. Chairman, I said, my voice cutting through the procedural murmurs. There is one final matter. A ripple of surprise went through the virtual grid of faces. The narrative, as far as they were concerned, had concluded, but I had saved the epilogue. I reached into my briefcase and drew out the cream-colored envelope. It felt ancient in my hands, a relic from another time. The paper was thick, softened with age, the corners gently frayed. The wax seal on the back was my mother's, a simple, elegant E for Evelyn, pressed into the now brittle burgundy wax. I placed it gently on the obsidian table, where it sat in stark contrast to the modern, sterile equipment surrounding it. It was a piece of the past, brought forth to dictate the future. What is this? Alistair asked, his curiosity piqued. This, I said, is a private communication from a co-founder of this company. I let my eyes drift to my father. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, a conversation a year after my mother's death. When I was settling her estate, he had found me in her old study, surrounded by boxes of papers. Don't go digging through the affairs of the dead. Harper, he had warned me, his voice carrying a strange edge of anxiety. Let her rest. I understood now that he wasn't protecting her memory. He was protecting his own secrets. I looked back at the chairman. My father once advised me not to disturb my mother's documents, but today, I find it necessary to listen to the words of a founder. I broke the delicate seal with my thumb. The sound was a faint crackle, a whisper from 20 years ago. I unfolded the single sheet of heavy bond paper. The ink was a faded blue-black. My mother's handwriting a series of elegant, forward-leaning strokes, as calm and determined as she had been in life. I did not read the entire letter aloud. I didn't need to. I had known its contents by heart for years. Mr. Chairman, this is a legally binding codicil to the charter of the Alderford Family Trust, executed by my mother, Evelyn Quinn, shortly before her death. It contains a specific, and until now, dormant provision. I took a breath, marshalling the precise legal language. It stipulates that in the event of a verifiable breach of corporate ethics or a finding of moral turpitude involving any senior executive of Lanford Systems, who is also a named trustee, full fiduciary and voting control of the trust's entire stake in the company immediately transfers to a designated co-trustee. A low murmur rippled through the board members on the screen. Arthur Vance, the general counsel, leaned forward, his eyes wide. And who, Alistair Finch asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is the designated co-trustee? I am, I said simply. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a chessboard being fundamentally rearranged in the final moments of the game. The Alderford Family Trust, I continued, my voice the only sound in the vacuum, holds a 12% voting stake in Lanford Systems. It is the single largest non-institutional block of shares, a significant block, perhaps the deciding one in any closely contested board vote. My father's head, which had been bowed in defeat, snapped up. His face was ashen, a mask of pure, uncomprehending disbelief. This was a ghost he never knew existed, a contingency he could never have planned for. This was a move from beyond the grave. Vivian stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the color draining from her face. The numbers were finally clicking into place in her mind. This wasn't just about suspension or even termination. This was about power, real power. Alistair Finch recovered first. He was a creature of process, of verification. Ms. Quinn, this is an extraordinary claim. Can you validate the legal standing of this document? I can, I replied. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to patch in Mr. Abernathy from the firm of Caldwell, Swain and Abernathy. He is the long-standing legal counsel for the trust. Alistair nodded, a few keystrokes later. A new face appeared on the screen, that of an elderly man with a shock of white hair and a kind, weary face. He sat in a wood-paneled office, surrounded by leather-bound books. Mr. Abernathy, the chairman said, you are in a recorded session of the Board of Directors of Lanford Systems. Can you confirm the existence and validity of the codicil Ms. Harper Quinn has just described? The old lawyer nodded gravely. I can, Mr. Chairman. I drafted it myself with Mrs. Quinn. It is ironclad. The triggering event, a formal board finding of ethical misconduct, has been met. As of your vote a few moments ago, control of the trust's 12% stake now rests solely with Ms. Harper Quinn, for as long as she deems the company's ethical standing to be at risk. The confirmation was absolute. The power was real. Alistair Finch looked at me, a new, complex expression in his eyes. It was a look of profound recalculation. The auditor had just become a kingmaker. Are you prepared to exercise that right, Ms. Quinn? He asked. Today? I met his gaze and held it. This was the true purpose of the day, the final destination of this long, painful road. It wasn't about the slap. It wasn't about the money. It was about the soul of the company my mother had poured her life into. I am, I said, my voice quiet but firm. If this board is prepared to choose real culture, not just slogans on a wall. Abernathy spoke again. Mr. Chairman, per the Trust's digital governance protocols, I have just activated Ms. Quinn's voting token. She should see a secure portal on her console. On my laptop screen, a new window materialized. It was a simple, secure voting interface, displaying the current motion before the board, a procedural vote on the formation of the special committee, and next to the options, a bar representing my new authority, Alderford Family Trust, 12%. My father closed his eyes. It was a slow, final surrender, a quiet acknowledgement of a checkmate he never saw coming. Vivian just stared at me, her eyes burning with a new kind of understanding. This was the conversation. This was the true meaning of, we'll talk Monday. It was never about an apology. It was about an accounting. A new motion was put forward by one of the independent directors. I move, she said, her voice crisp and clear, that the mandate of the special committee be expanded to include the immediate initiation of a search for a new chief executive officer and a full restructuring of the company's public relations and compliance divisions, to be consolidated under the direct oversight of the acting director of independent ethics. It was a power play, a move to completely clean house. Some of the more conservative board members hesitated. The vote was suddenly not a sure thing. The chair calls for a vote on the amended motion, Alistair announced. The percentages began to appear on the screen as the directors cast their votes. 3%, 8%, 15%. It stalled at 39%. A significant portion of the board was wavering, unwilling to take such a drastic step so quickly. 39% in favor. Not enough. All eyes in the room, physical and virtual, were on me. I moved my cursor. It hovered for a moment over the word abstain, then moved decisively to the box beside the word support. I clicked. The number on the screen jumped instantly. 39% became 51%. Consensus. The motion passed. It had taken less than 6 minutes from the moment I revealed the letter to the moment I fundamentally altered the future of the company. A quiet turn of a key, a soft click of a mouse, and the entire edifice of their power had been razed to the ground. The vote was the silent, invisible tsunami. The consequences were the wreckage washing ashore in real time, the moment the motion passed. The machinery of the corporation, which had been co-opted and corrupted for years, began to grind back towards its true purpose, with the brutal, impersonal efficiency of a factory floor. The boardroom was no longer a chamber of debate. It was now a command center executing a coup. While the board members on screen began the formal process of drafting minutes and assigning tasks to the special committee, Alistair Finch gave a curt nod to the general counsel. Arthur Vance picked up his phone, and the fallout began to radiate outwards from our glass-walled room on the 37th floor. The first wave was digital. At 3:41 p.m., an email, drafted by our external PR firm and approved in seconds by the chairman, was released on the national newswire. It was a masterpiece of corporate crisis communication, calm, concise, and utterly devastating. It read, "For immediate release, Lanford Systems announces leadership review. Suspends 2 executives." The body of the text was sparse, providing just enough information to be transparent without being salacious. Lanford Systems today announced that its board of directors has suspended CEO Daniel Quinn's executive authority pending a special committee review. Additionally, Vivian Quinn, VP of Corporate Culture, and Sloan Quinn, Director of Brand Experience, have been suspended indefinitely, effective immediately. The decision follows an internal review which found evidence of serious ethical and financial violations. The board is committed to upholding the highest standards of governance and integrity. Further updates will be provided as the independent investigation proceeds. The story hit the terminals of every major financial news outlet within a minute. It was a clean, sharp incision, a public statement that cauterized the wound before it could fester into a messy scandal. The video clip of the slap at the church was never mentioned. It would not be leaked to the press or splashed across the tabloids. It had served its purpose. I transferred the file from the USB drive to a secure internal server, accessible only by the special committee and Arthur Vance's office. A copy was dispatched via a secure courier to the Diocesan Ethics Committee that oversaw St. Ren's. The slap was a matter of record, not of public spectacle. It was evidence, not entertainment. My role in the boardroom was over. I gathered my things, the binders, my laptop, my mother's Bible. As I stood, Alistair Finch's voice came through the speakers. "Ms. Quinn," he said, his tone formal, "the board thanks you for your diligence." It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement of a necessary, if unpleasant, function, like a surgeon thanking his scalpel. I walked to the heavy glass door and pulled it open. The contrast between the silent, high-stakes tension of the conference room and the mundane, late-afternoon hum of the office was jarring. People were at their desks, keyboards clicking, phones ringing softly. But as I stepped out into the wide, open-plan space of the executive floor, a change occurred. A ripple of awareness spread through the rows of cubicles. Heads lifted, conversations faltered. They looked at me. No one smiled. No one offered a thumbs up or a word of support. But there was no pity in their eyes, either. There was something else. A clear, sharp, and unambiguous understanding. The whispers that had circulated for months. The rumors of lavish spending, the quiet resentment over Vivian's reign of culture had just been validated. I wasn't the CEO's difficult daughter anymore. I was the person who had finally spoken the truth they all knew. In their gazes, I saw the silent, grim satisfaction of a long overdue accounting. Across the floor, I saw the security guards approach my father's office. Vivian was there, trying to talk to him, her voice a low, frantic hiss. Daniel was just sitting in his chair, staring out the window, a man made of glass. One of the guards, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Marcus, whom I knew from the elevator, spoke to them. His voice was too low to hear, but his posture was the epitome of polite, unyielding authority. He was not restraining them, he was informing them. Vivian began to protest, her voice rising, but Marcus simply shook his head slightly. She and my father were being asked to leave the premises, to preserve the integrity of the evidence, to protect the sanctity of the crime scene. They were being politely, professionally, and publicly escorted from the building they had treated as their personal kingdom. My phone buzzed in my hand, a text message. It was from Sloan. The text consisted of 3 words, a childish, simplistic summary of a complex and devastating day. You won. I stopped walking. I stood by the ficus tree near the elevators, the scent of its waxy leaves filling my senses. I thought of the forged receipts, the Instagrammed cocktails, the casual, thoughtless complicity. I typed my reply, my thumb moving with cold precision. No, you signed your own expense reports. I hit send. It was not a judgment, it was a fact, a simple statement of cause and effect, the foundation upon which my entire world was built. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside, alone. The polished steel doors slid shut, and for a moment, I was faced with my own reflection. A woman in a stark white blouse, her face pale and composed, her eyes carrying a profound and bottomless exhaustion. My gaze fell to my wrist, the one Vivian had grabbed with such wiry strength. The faint reddish marks were almost gone, a fading ghost of the morning's insult. The physical wound had healed. The deeper ones would take longer. As the elevator began its smooth, silent descent, I took out my phone and composed one final email. It was addressed to the company's interim CFO, a man I trusted implicitly. The subject was, Restitution for St. Ren's. The message was brief. Please initiate a corporate donation to the St. Ren's Community Charity Fund for the full amount of the improperly categorized expenses. The funds are to be transferred directly, with a letter explaining that Lanford Systems is correcting a previous accounting error. There will be no intermediaries. I sent it. The money would be returned, not through a shell company for PR credit, but quietly and directly. The damage would be repaired. A few floors below, in his rectory office, Father Gabriel would soon receive a call. Not from Vivian promising new pews in exchange for social standing, but from an accountant in a gray suit, informing him that a mistake was being corrected. The corrupt pipeline was closed. The spigot turned off for good. Back on the 37th floor, a notification would be popping up on the company's intranet. The Human Resources Department, now acting under the board's direct authority, was posting the schedule for a new series of mandatory ethics workshops. The curriculum, which I had written myself months ago in anticipation of this day, was attached. There would be no lunches at Finch and Ivy. There would be no martinis. There would only be case studies, regulations, and hard questions with verifiable answers. The elevator doors opened onto the vast marble-floored lobby. The late afternoon sun slanted through the towering glass walls, long golden bars striping the floor. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking a steady, resolute rhythm. I glanced at the large digital clock above the security desk. The numbers were stark and black against a white background. 3:59 p.m. The end of a business day, and for some people, the sudden, shocking midnight of the rest of their lives. I did not return to the boardroom. There was nothing left for me there. Instead, I walked back to my own office on the 37th floor. the space of clean lines and stark functionality that had served as my sanctuary and my command center. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 36 hours was beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. But the work was not quite finished. My movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. I opened the secure, fireproof filing cabinet in the corner of my office. One by one, I took the files from my briefcase, the printouts of the bank transfers, the forged invoices, the damning email chains, and placed them inside the box that had been designated as the official repository for the special committee's investigation. They were no longer my evidence. They were now part of the corporate record, artifacts of a truth that could no longer be denied. Finally, only one item was left on my desk: my mother's Bible. I picked it up, the worn leather a familiar, comforting weight in my hand. For a moment, I stood holding it, thinking of the woman who had given it to me, the woman whose quiet integrity I had tried to honor. This book was not a weapon, and it was not a shield. It was a compass. It had pointed me toward my true north, and I had followed. I placed it gently back into its usual spot on the second shelf of my personal bookcase, next to a well-read copy of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I locked the glass door of the cabinet. A quiet click in a quiet room. A chapter closed. A soft knock came at my open door. It was Alistair Finch, the chairman of the board. He had left the virtual meeting and come to find me in person. He stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure, his face etched with the fatigue of the afternoon's events. He looked around my sparse office, his gaze lingering for a moment on the orchid on my desk. "The board has been fully briefed. The committees are in motion," he said, his voice a low baritone. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You did a difficult thing today. Harper." He paused, then corrected himself, using my new, temporary title. "Thank you, Acting Director of Ethics and Compliance." I met his gaze. I did not want his gratitude, nor did I feel I had earned it. I had not acted out of bravery or nobility. I had acted out of necessity. I had simply followed the logical endpoint of a set of facts. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Chairman," I replied. The answer was simple, and it was the truth. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The conversation was over. We both understood that what had happened was not a victory to be celebrated, but a failure of governance to be corrected. I packed the last of my personal items into my briefcase. As I stepped out into the hallway, the elevator doors at the far end of the floor opened. The atmosphere in the office had changed. The earlier, tense silence had been replaced by a low, productive hum. The body had identified the cancer. The surgeons had made the incision, and now the healing process, slow and painful, could begin. The air, which had been thick with unspoken fear, now carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the break room and the crisp, clean smell of paper spooling out of the high-volume printers. The scent of work, the scent of a future. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new text message had appeared on the screen. The sender was Daniel, my father. The message consisted of 2 words, a lifetime of regret and failure compressed into a single, desperate plea. "I'm sorry." I stared at the words. I felt a flicker of something, a distant echo of a daughter's pain, but it was faint, buried under layers of cold, hard reality. An apology was a currency for emotional debts. This was a matter for a ledger. His message was a line item in a column that could never be balanced. I did not reply. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the message unread and unanswered. His apology was 24 hours too late. It was a day late and millions of dollars short. My duty was not to him, it was to the process. I opened my secure messaging app and sent one last directive to my legal team, who I knew were already working late, preparing the necessary documents. Evidence sealed and transferred to the special committee. Begin the clawback process on all executive compensation for the preceding 36 months, immediately. There would be no quiet retirements, no golden parachutes. Every dollar, every bonus, every stock option tainted by the fraud would be pursued and recovered. The accounting would be absolute. As I waited for the elevator, a young woman from the marketing department, an analyst I recognized but didn't know by name, approached me hesitantly. She was clutching a stack of papers to her chest, her eyes wide. "Ms. Quinn?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Harper? Is everything going to be okay?" It was a question for the entire company, for all the employees whose futures had been jeopardized. They were the true victims of this quiet, bloodless crime. I looked at her, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. It was tired, but it was real. "It is now," I said. "Everything is going to be okay." She nodded, a wave of visible relief washing over her. She gave me a tentative smile in return before hurrying back to her desk. The elevator arrived. As I stepped inside, the doors closing me into the small steel and glass box, I caught my reflection one last time. I looked up, past my own tired face, and through the glass walls of the lobby, I could see the sky. The late afternoon sun had begun its descent, and the sky over Alderford was a brilliant, cloudless expanse of the deepest blue. It was cold, it was clear, it was real. He had promised me a conversation, a deferral of truth, a delay of accountability. He thought he was setting the timeline, controlling the narrative. He was wrong. The conversation had happened, on my terms, in my arena, with my evidence. I leaned my head back against the cool wall of the elevator, the quiet hum a soothing vibration. I spoke the words aloud, my voice a soft whisper in the enclosed space, a final, definitive entry in the day's long, exhaustive ledger. "We'll talk Monday?" I said to my reflection, a faint, ironic smile touching my lips. "We just did." The screen goes black. The end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'm so grateful to have you here with me. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and if you'd like to show some extra support, hitting that hype button really helps this story get heard by more people. Thank you again.